Jake Morrison stood in the massive crystal hall and felt very small among the tall elven nobles who looked down at him with cold eyes that showed their disgust without hiding it at all, because they did not care what he thought about them and their opinions of his worthless human race that had barely left their own solar system when the elves had been traveling between stars for thousands of years before humans even discovered fire, according to their history books. The royal advisor stepped forward with a scroll that glowed with ancient magic and began reading the will of King Thalorian, who had died 3 weeks ago from what they called a mysterious illness that Jake suspected was anything but mysterious, given how nervous some of these nobles looked when the sickness was mentioned in conversation. The advisor announced that Jake Morrison, of Earth, would receive guardianship of Princess Lyra Silvermoon and her dragon companion Ember, which made every elf in the room gasp in shock and anger, because giving a human such an honor was unthinkable, and possibly the greatest insult the late king could have delivered to his own daughter. Lyra emerged from behind a pillar of pure starlight crystal, and Jake saw her for the first time as she walked toward him, with movements so graceful they seemed like dancing, even though her face showed nothing but pure hatred for him and everything he represented in her perfect world of elven superiority. She was beautiful, in a way that hurt to look at, with skin like moonlight and hair that shifted between silver and blue, depending on how the light hit it. And her eyes were the color of deep violets that grew in the royal gardens, but those eyes held nothing but contempt as she circled him like a predator examining prey that was not even worth eating. Behind her walked Ember, and the dragon was massive with scales that looked like rubies had been melted and poured over his body and wings that could block out the sun when fully spread, and smoke came from his nostrils with every breath he took, while studying Jake with intelligence that was almost frightening in its depth. Lyra laughed, and the sound reminded Jake of glass breaking in slow motion, as she said that her father must have lost his mind completely to think that a human could ever be worthy of guarding someone of royal elven blood when humans were barely more than children playing with technology they did not fully understand. She listed all of his failures as a species in a voice that carried across the hall so everyone could hear her mocking words about how humans lived less than 100 years, which was barely enough time to learn anything important, and how they had no magic in their blood, and had to rely on crude machines to do what elves could accomplish with a simple thought. Jake stood quietly and let her speak, because he had learned in the military that sometimes the best strategy was to let your enemy reveal everything they thought about you before you showed them what you were really capable of doing when pushed into a corner. Ember growled low in his throat, and the sound made the crystal walls vibrate slightly as the dragon moved closer to Jake and sniffed at him with nostrils that were bigger than Jake's head and could probably swallow him in one bite if the dragon decided he was not worth keeping alive. Lyra continued her speech about how humans were weak and soft and relied on numbers instead of individual strength, and how their technology would fail them when facing real magic, wielded by those who had studied the arts for centuries, while human lifespans meant they could never achieve true mastery of anything important. The nobles murmured their agreement, and Jake could see they shared her views completely, because to them humans were nothing more than upstart children who had gotten lucky with some inventions, but would never be equals to the elder races who had ruled the galaxy, long before Earth had even formed from cosmic dust. But Jake noticed something that Lyra was trying very hard to hide beneath all her arrogant words and mocking tone, which was the way her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was looking, and how her eyes kept darting to the shadows in the corners of the hall as if expecting something terrible to emerge from the darkness at any moment. He also noticed which nobles seemed too pleased with this arrangement, and which ones looked genuinely worried about the princess being given to a human guardian, because their reactions told him more about the political situation than any briefing could have provided. The advisor finished reading the will and explained that according to elven law, The decree could not be challenged for 1 full year, which meant Jake was stuck with Lyra, and she was stuck with him, whether either of them wanted this arrangement or not. Lyra turned to Jake and told him directly that she would not obey a single command from someone whose entire species had not even mastered basic dimensional travel, and that he should prepare himself for the most miserable year of his short, pathetic life, because she would make certain he regretted ever meeting her father. Jake finally spoke for the first time since entering the hall, and his voice was calm and steady as he said that he had not asked for this responsibility, but he would honor the king's wishes because the man had once saved his life during a diplomatic mission gone wrong, and he always paid his debts no matter how difficult the payment might be. This seemed to surprise Lyra because she had expected him to argue or complain or show some emotion other than quiet acceptance of an impossible situation that most humans would have rejected immediately. Ember made a sound that might have been approval or might have been warning, and Jake could not tell which because he had never learned to read dragon expressions during his brief time in the diplomatic corps. The nobles began filing out of the hall, and Jake caught snippets of their conversations about how the mighty had fallen, and how the royal line was now tainted by association with lesser beings, and how this proved that King Thalorian had indeed gone mad before his death. One noble stopped near Jake and whispered that he should refuse the guardianship before it was too late, because Lyra was cursed, and everyone who got close to her ended up dead in mysterious circumstances that could never be quite explained but happened too frequently to be coincidence. Jake filed that information away in his mind, along with everything else he had observed during this strange ceremony, because his instincts told him that King Thalorian had not made this decision out of madness, but out of desperate necessity. Lyra walked toward the exit with Ember following close behind, and she called back to Jake without looking at him, that his quarters were in the servants' wing where he belonged, and that he should stay out of her way unless he wanted to discover just how creative she could be when making someone's life unbearable. Jake watched her go and knew that the next year would either kill him or teach him things about elven politics and dragon warfare that no human had ever learned before, and either way it would be interesting. He had survived the Kreth Swarms and the Void Wars and countless other conflicts that should have ended him, but somehow he kept living when better soldiers died around him, and he figured that same stubborn luck might get him through whatever was coming next. As the last nobles departed, Jake stood alone in the Crystal Hall and wondered what King Thalorian had really known about the threats facing his daughter and why he had chosen a human with no magic and no special abilities to stand between her and whatever darkness was coming. 3 nights passed on Jake's ship called the Wanderer, and Lyra had barely spoken to him except to complain about the cramped quarters and primitive human technology that she claimed was like living in a cave compared to elven vessels that bent space and time with elegance. Jake let her complain, because he was busy running security checks and monitoring communication channels for threats that he knew would come eventually, because princesses did not get human guardians unless someone wanted them dead, and their father knew traditional elven guards could not be trusted. The attack came during the night cycle when most species slept, and Lyra was in her cabin dreaming of whatever elven royalty dreamed about when shadow walkers phased through the hull like ghosts, passing through walls using forbidden magic that violated physics in ways human scientists still could not explain. Lyra woke to cold steel pressed against her throat and a voice whispering that her father's madness ended tonight with her blood and that the elven race would be purified of his weakness and his alliance with inferior species. She tried to summon her magic, but the blade was coated with null poison that blocked her connection to the energy flows that powered elven sorcery, and she realized with horror that she was helpless against trained assassins who had planned for every defense she might use. Then Jake was there, moving faster than should be possible for a human without enhancement or magic, and his combat knife took the first assassin in the throat before the elf could even turn to face this new threat. The second assassin teleported behind Jake and swung a blade that would have decapitated him, but Jake had already dropped to the floor and fired his plasma pistol upward through the spot where he knew the assassin would appear because humans studied patterns and predicted movements instead of relying on magical senses. The third assassin grabbed Lyra and began the teleport sequence that would take them both away to wherever they planned to finish killing her in private without witnesses to complicate their story. Jake did something insane, even by human standards, which was to grab both of them just as the teleport activated and hold on, despite the agony of shadow walking without magical protection, as his molecules were pulled apart and reassembled across space in a way that killed most beings who tried it without proper training. They materialized in an alley on Duskholm, which was a moon known for criminal activity and loose law enforcement, and the assassin was dead with his neck broken because Jake had twisted during transport and used the momentum to snap the elf's spine. Jake collapsed, bleeding from his eyes and ears and nose because shadow walking tore at human biology in ways that should have killed him. But somehow he was still breathing and still conscious, despite pain that would have knocked most species into shock. Lyra stared at him in complete disbelief, because humans were not supposed to survive shadow walking at all since the magical energies destroyed unprotected tissue and scrambled brain functions. But this human had not only survived but had killed a trained assassin during the process. Ember appeared through a portal of his own making, and the dragon's eyes widened when he saw Jake still alive, because in 3,000 years of life, Ember had never seen a human endure shadow walking and remain conscious afterward. Lyra's hands shook as she tried to use her magic to heal Jake, but her power was still partially blocked by the null poison in her system, and she could only manage minor repairs to his damaged blood vessels. Jake spat blood and grinned at her with red teeth as he said that humans were really good at not dying when they were supposed to, because their species had survived everything the universe threw at them through sheer stubborn refusal to accept death as inevitable. He explained that human bodies were adaptable in ways that elder races had lost through genetic specialization, and that while they might not have magic or long lifespans, they could take incredible damage and keep fighting through willpower alone. Lyra realized she was crying, which shocked her, because elven princesses did not cry, especially not over humans who were supposed to be beneath their concern. But this human had just thrown himself into magical agony to save her life. Without hesitation, Ember spoke for the first time to Jake in a voice like rocks grinding together and said that perhaps King Thalorian had been wiser than anyone suspected, because this human understood something that many elves had forgotten, which was that true strength came from choosing to fight impossible battles. Anyway, Jake managed to stand despite his injuries and told them they needed to move because shadow walkers never worked alone, and more assassins would come once the first team failed to report their success. Lyra asked who would hire the Shadow Walkers Guild, because their services cost more than most planets' annual budgets, and only the wealthiest individuals or organizations could afford them. Jake said that was exactly the right question, because whoever wanted her dead had enormous resources and political connections, which meant this conspiracy went higher than simple rival nobles trying to eliminate competition. They made their way through Duskholm's dark streets, while Jake contacted his old military connections and arranged transport to somewhere safer than a criminal moon where assassins could operate without interference from authorities. Lyra kept looking at Jake differently now because her mockery seemed hollow after watching him nearly die to protect her, and she wondered what other assumptions she had made about humans that were completely wrong. Ember walked beside Jake instead of behind him, which was significant because dragons showed respect through position, and choosing to walk beside someone meant acknowledging them as equals rather than inferiors. Jake's bleeding stopped eventually, though his eyes were still bloodshot, and his movements showed the pain he was suppressing through training and discipline that came from years of combat experience. Lyra asked him why he had grabbed the teleporting assassin when he knew shadow walking would probably kill him, and his answer was simple, which was that letting her die was not an option. he considered acceptable regardless of the personal cost. She realized that her father had not chosen Jake because he was the best warrior or the most skilled guardian, but because he was the type of person who would die before failing in his duty to protect someone he was responsible for. This was something elven culture had lost over millennia of stability and peace, because they had forgotten what it meant to face extinction and fight with desperate determination that came from knowing your species could be wiped out if you failed. Humans still remembered because they had nearly gone extinct multiple times in their short history, and that memory was burned into their genetic code, making them capable of impossible determination when survival was at stake. They reached the spaceport and boarded a transport that Jake had arranged through channels Lyra did not ask about because she was beginning to understand that humans had networks and connections that operated outside official channels. As they left Duskholm behind, Lyra sat next to Jake and said quietly that she had been wrong to mock him and his species because she had judged based on power and longevity instead of character and courage. Jake told her that mockery did not bother him because he had heard worse from people whose opinions actually mattered to him, but he appreciated the apology anyway. Ember settled in the cargo bay, and his thoughts touched both their minds, saying that the small human had earned respect today through actions rather than words, which was the only currency that mattered to dragons. Lyra realized that the next assassination attempt would come soon, because whoever hired the Shadow Walkers would not stop after one failure, and she wondered if Jake truly understood what he had committed himself to by accepting her father's will. But looking at his determined expression and remembering how he had held on to her during the shadow walk, despite agony that should have killed him, she thought that maybe he understood perfectly and had chosen this path anyway, because that was what humans did when they made promises. They flew toward human space, where Jake said they would be safer while investigating who wanted Lyra dead and why King Thalorian had been murdered, because Jake was now certain it had been murder and not illness that killed the king. Lyra asked how he knew, and Jake explained that kings did not give their daughters to random humans unless they suspected their own court was compromised and needed outside help from someone who could not be influenced by elven politics or magic. She saw the logic in his reasoning and felt a chill, because it meant her father had known he was going to die and had planned for her protection. Knowing that no elf could be trusted with her safety, Jake promised her that they would find the conspirators and make them pay for killing her father and trying to kill her. But first they needed to survive long enough to uncover the truth. Lyra believed him, because he had already proven he would keep his promises, even if keeping them meant dying in the process, and that was more than she could say for most of the elven nobles she had known her entire life. They arrived at New Terra, which was humanity's fortress world, and Lyra felt her assumptions shatter the moment they entered orbit, because she had expected primitive cities and crude technology, but instead saw gleaming metropolises that rivaled anything the elven worlds had built. The cities used quantum manipulation that mimicked magic through pure science, and their defensive systems could track threats across multiple dimensions, simultaneously using mathematics instead of mystical energy, which Lyra found both fascinating and slightly disturbing. Jake took her to meet Colonel Kate Harper, who commanded the Human Defense Forces and was one of the people who had helped decrypt a hidden message in King Thalorian's will using techniques that combined ancient elven writing with human cryptography. Kate was a tall woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and she greeted Lyra with professional courtesy that lacked the mockery or reverence that most people showed when meeting elven royalty, which was refreshing after decades of false respect. She showed them the decoded message on holographic displays that floated in the air, and Lyra read her father's final words with growing horror because they revealed a conspiracy that went far deeper than simple assassination attempts. King Thalorian had discovered that members of his own court were part of a supremacist movement that believed in keeping the elven race pure and separate from what they called lesser species, who they saw as contaminating the galaxy with their presence. These conspirators had poisoned the king slowly over months, using a substance that mimicked natural illness and could not be detected by normal medical scans, because it was designed specifically to kill elves while leaving no trace. Their plan was to assassinate Lyra and make it look like human aggression, which would trigger a war between the Elven Dominion and the Human Systems Alliance that would weaken both sides and allow the conspirators to seize power in the chaos. Once in control, they would establish an empire built on genetic superiority and species segregation that would enforce strict hierarchies based on biology rather than merit or achievement. Thalorian had given Lyra to Jake because humans had something elves had lost over millennia of civilization, which was the ability to fight without honor when survival demanded it, and to be unpredictable in ways that elegant elven warfare could never counter. Kate explained that human military doctrine was based on the assumption that you were already dead, which freed you to take risks that other species would never consider because they valued their long lives too much to gamble them on desperate tactics. Lyra understood now why her father had chosen this path, because traditional elven guards would follow rules and protocols that the conspirators could predict and counter. But a human warrior operated on completely different principles that made him dangerous in ways her enemies could not anticipate. Jake added that humans had survived against impossible odds throughout their history by refusing to accept defeat even when logic said they should surrender, and that stubborn determination had become part of their cultural identity. Ember, who had been listening quietly, spoke in his deep voice that rumbled through the room, saying that the king had been wiser than most dragons because he understood that sometimes survival required choosing allies who fought dirty rather than allies who fought beautifully. Kate showed them intelligence reports that identified several key conspirators, including nobles who had been close to Thalorian and had used their positions to influence policy, while slowly poisoning him and preparing for the moment when they could strike at his daughter. The conspirators had resources across multiple systems and had been planning this coup for decades, waiting for the right moment to execute their vision of a purified galaxy where elder races ruled and younger species served. Lyra felt sick, realizing how many people she had trusted were actually working to kill her and destroy everything her father had built through his alliances and diplomatic efforts to unite different species in mutual cooperation. Jake said they had one advantage, which was that the conspirators believed humans were primitive and beneath concern, so they would not expect serious resistance from someone they saw as barely more intelligent than trained animals. Kate agreed and outlined a plan that involved using human intelligence networks to track the conspirators' movements, while Jake kept Lyra safe and gathered evidence that could expose the conspiracy to the galactic community. Lyra asked what would happen if they failed, and Kate's answer was blunt, saying that millions would die in a war that would devastate both human and elven civilizations, while the conspirators seized power and began systematically eliminating or enslaving species they deemed inferior. The weight of that responsibility settled on Lyra's shoulders, and she realized that her father had not just given her a guardian, but had given her a mission to stop a threat that endangered the entire galactic order. Jake could see she was overwhelmed, and told her that she did not have to carry this burden alone, because that was the whole point of having allies who would stand with you against impossible odds. She looked at him and saw not a lesser being, but someone who had already proven his worth through actions and whose species had earned their place in the galaxy through determination rather than genetic advantages. Ember moved closer to both of them, and his presence was comforting despite his massive size, because dragons represented stability and ancient wisdom that had endured through countless wars and political upheavals. Kate gave them access to human military resources, including safe houses and communication networks that the conspirators could not monitor because they were built on technology that elven magic could not easily penetrate or trace. Lyra spent the next few days learning about human culture, and was surprised to discover depth and complexity she had never expected from a species she had dismissed as temporary and insignificant. She watched human soldiers training in combat techniques that compensated for their lack of inherent power with brutal efficiency, and realized that what they lacked in magic, they made up for in innovation and adaptability. Jake taught her about human history and their wars against species like the Kreth swarms, who had nearly exterminated humanity until humans developed tactics so vicious and unrelenting that the Kreth eventually sued for peace rather than continue fighting. She began to understand that humans were dangerous, not because they were strong, but because they refused to stay dead and would sacrifice everything, including their own lives, to protect what they valued. One evening she asked Jake why humans fought so hard when they knew they would die eventually anyway, and his answer was simple, saying that the shortness of life made it more precious, not less, and that humans learned to make every moment count, because they had so few moments compared to elder races. This perspective was alien to Lyra, who had always assumed she would live for thousands of years, and had never felt urgency about accomplishing anything, because there was always more time. She realized that human determination came from knowing time was limited, which created a sense of purpose that elves had lost through the comfort of near immortality. Ember observed all of this and told Lyra privately that humans reminded him of young dragons who had not yet learned caution and still believed they could challenge the universe and win through sheer defiance. Kate called them to a briefing and revealed that the conspirators were planning their major move during the Festival of Three Moons, which was a peace summit on the neutral station called Crosspoint, where leaders from multiple species would gather. The plan was to massacre everyone at the summit and blame it on human extremists, which would trigger the war the conspirators needed while eliminating multiple political leaders who might oppose their rise to power. They had 72 hours to stop an army and prevent a war, and the odds of success were almost zero. According to every tactical analysis Kate ran through her computers. Jake looked at the numbers and grinned, saying that humans specialized in beating impossible odds, and that 72 hours was plenty of time if they were willing to fight dirty and take risks that sane people would never consider. Lyra realized she was smiling too, because something about Jake's confidence was infectious, and for the first time since her father's death, she felt hope that maybe they could actually win this impossible battle. Jake spent the 72 hours building an alliance that made no sense by traditional military standards, because he recruited dishonored elven guards who still remembered their oaths to Thalorian, and human special forces who specialized in impossible missions, and mercenary dragon riders who cared more about profit than politics. He also contacted criminal syndicates who would lose enormous amounts of money if a galactic war disrupted their trade routes and convinced them that helping stop the conspiracy was good business. Even if it meant working with law enforcement temporarily, Kate provided intelligence and logistics, while Jake coordinated the different groups into something that resembled a fighting force, though it lacked the elegant organization that elven military commanders would have demanded. Lyra watched him work and marveled at how he managed to get such different groups to cooperate by appealing to each one's specific interests, rather than trying to inspire them with grand speeches about honor or duty. The human approach was messy and chaotic, but it was also effective because within 60 hours, Jake had assembled a force that could potentially counter the conspirators' army if everything went perfectly, which it never did in real combat. They traveled to Crosspoint Station, which was a massive structure floating in neutral space, where the Festival of Three Moons was already underway, with diplomats and leaders from dozens of species gathering for speeches and negotiations. The conspirators had infiltrated security and planted weapons throughout the station while positioning their soldiers to look like regular festival attendees until the moment came to strike Jake. Split his forces into small teams that would hit multiple targets simultaneously, because humans had learned that distributed attacks were harder to counter than concentrated assaults. That enemies could focus their defenses against. Lyra stayed with Jake because her magic was their most powerful weapon if they could use it strategically instead of relying on traditional elven combat techniques that the conspirators would expect and plan for. Jake taught her to think like a human fighter, which meant using her teleportation not for graceful dueling but for brutal ambushes, where she would appear behind enemies and strike before they could react. She found this approach distasteful at first because it violated everything she had learned about honorable combat, but Jake explained that honor meant nothing if you were dead and your enemies had won. Ember flew patrol around the station with other dragons who had been convinced to help either through loyalty to the old king or through promises of treasure that the criminal syndicates had funded. The attack began when conspirator soldiers revealed themselves and opened fire on the main assembly hall, where hundreds of diplomats were gathered expecting a peaceful celebration. Jake's teams responded immediately, hitting weapons caches before the conspirators could fully arm themselves and disrupting communication networks so the enemy could not coordinate their scattered forces effectively. Lyra teleported through the chaos with Jake following close behind, and her magic combined with his tactical thinking created devastating results as they eliminated key conspirator leaders who had expected to direct the battle from safety. The fighting was brutal and nothing like the elegant warfare shown in elven training videos because humans fought to win rather than to demonstrate skill, and they used every advantage, including attacking from unexpected angles and ignoring traditional rules of engagement. Ember burned through squads of enemy soldiers who tried to commandeer the station's reactor, hoping to destroy everything if they could not win, which showed their true nature as fanatics willing to kill millions for their twisted ideology. But the conspirators had planned well, and they managed to capture Lyra during a moment when she was separated from Jake by an explosion that collapsed part of the station's structure. They dragged her to the main plaza and broadcast across all channels that unless Jake surrendered immediately, they would execute the princess and make it look like human forces had killed her, which would still trigger the war they wanted. Jake received the message while fighting through corridors filled with enemies, and his face went cold in a way that made even his own soldiers nervous, because they recognized the expression of someone who had decided that death was acceptable if it meant completing the mission. He contacted Ember and told the dragon that he needed the bond, which made Ember hesitate, because bonding between dragon and rider was sacred and permanent, and if one died, the other died as well. Lyra heard this through her captor's communication feeds and screamed for Jake not to do it, because bonding would mean he could never leave her service, and if he died fighting to save her, then Ember would die too. But Ember understood what Jake was really asking for, which was not just power, but trust. And the dragon realized that this human had earned that trust through actions that proved his character beyond any doubt. The bond formed like fire igniting in both their minds, and Jake suddenly felt Ember's ancient power flowing through him along with millennia of combat experience and dragon rage that had been contained by civilization's rules. At the same time, Ember felt Jake's human determination and that insane, stubborn refusal to accept defeat that made humans so dangerous when they decided something was worth dying for. Together, they became something new that had not existed before, which was a human with dragon power, guided by tactical thinking that no pure dragon would ever develop because dragons relied on overwhelming force rather than clever strategy. Jake tore through the remaining conspirator forces like a storm given human shape, and Ember's fire came from his hands, while dragon strength let him move faster than elven reflexes could track. He reached the plaza where Lyra was held, and the conspirator leader who held a blade to her throat demanded surrender. But Jake just smiled and asked if the elf really thought a dragon-bonded human cared about threats. The fight that followed would be remembered for generations, because Jake used Ember's power with human unpredictability, creating attacks that came from impossible angles, and combining magic with technology in ways that violated every rule of traditional combat. Lyra broke free during the chaos, and her magic joined with Jake's dragon-enhanced abilities to create devastation that swept away the conspirators' remaining forces. The leader tried to teleport away, but Ember had blocked dimensional exits around the plaza, and the conspirator realized too late that he had been outmaneuvered by beings he had dismissed as inferior. Kate's forces arrived to secure the station and arrest the surviving conspirators, while evidence of the plot was broadcast across all channels, so every species could see the truth about what had almost happened. The diplomats who had survived the attack voted immediately to form a joint investigation that would root out any remaining conspirators and ensure this kind of supremacist movement could never threaten the galactic peace again. Jake stood with Lyra and Ember in the aftermath, watching as human and elven forces worked together to help the wounded and repair damage to the station. The bond between him and Ember was permanent now, which meant he would live as long as the dragon did, because their life forces were connected through magic that even human science could not fully explain. Lyra looked at him with an expression that mixed gratitude and something deeper that she was not ready to name yet, and she said quietly that her father had been right about everything. Jake replied that Thalorian had been a wise king who understood that survival sometimes required trusting people who seemed like impossible choices. Ember rumbled in contentment because the dragon had waited 3,000 years to find a rider worthy of the bond, and this small human with his stubborn courage had proven himself beyond any doubt. They had won an impossible victory against overwhelming odds and saved countless lives while exposing a conspiracy that would have reshaped the galaxy into something dark and terrible. But Jake knew that this was just the beginning, because there would be other threats and other battles, and his bond with Ember meant he was committed to fighting them all alongside Lyra for as long as the dragon lived. He found that he did not mind this future, because somewhere during the past weeks the princess who had mocked him had become someone he would die to protect, and the dragon who had judged him had become a partner who understood him better than most humans ever would. The Festival of Three Moons continued after repairs were made, and this time it was a true celebration, as different species recognized that working together had saved them all from a war that would have benefited no one except fanatics who valued genetic purity over cooperation and peace. 6 months passed after the Battle of Crosspoint, and Lyra stood in the Hall of Heroes on New Terra, watching as workers unveiled a monument dedicated to everyone who had fought to stop the conspiracy and save the peace that so many species depended on. Jake stood beside her wearing formal attire that looked uncomfortable on someone more used to combat gear and tactical equipment. But he endured it because Kate had insisted this ceremony was important for political reasons. The monument showed humans and elves fighting together with a dragon flying overhead, and the artist had captured something true about how the battle had felt when different species united against a common threat that endangered them all. Lyra noticed that tourists and visitors kept staring at Jake with expressions of awe and curiosity because the first human dragon rider in recorded history was still enough of a novelty that people wanted to see if he was real. Ember lounged near the monument, looking pleased with himself because dragons enjoyed being remembered in art and sculpture, and this particular dragon had good reason to feel proud about his choice of rider. The political landscape had shifted dramatically in the months following the battle because the conspiracy's exposure had forced the Elven Dominion to acknowledge that humans were not primitive inferiors, but valuable allies who had saved Elven civilization from its own worst elements. New treaties were being negotiated that would create true partnership between species rather than the condescending tolerance that elves had previously offered to younger races. Kate approached them and said quietly, that intelligence reports showed some conspirators had escaped justice and were rebuilding their networks in hidden locations throughout the galaxy, which meant the fight was not truly over. Jake nodded because he had expected this, since fanatics rarely gave up after a single defeat, and would probably spend years planning revenge while recruiting new followers to their cause of genetic supremacy. But he also knew that the conspiracy had lost its greatest advantage, which was operating in secret, and now that everyone knew about the threat they could work together to counter it, Lyra asked Kate how the joint investigation was progressing and learned that hundreds of conspirators had been arrested across multiple systems, while evidence continued to emerge about how deep the movement had penetrated into various governments and institutions. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering because it had taken decades to build and involve thousands of people who genuinely believed that segregating species was the only way to preserve what they called racial purity. Kate explained that many of the arrested conspirators were being offered reduced sentences in exchange for testimony against the leadership, which was slowly dismantling the organization from within. Lyra felt conflicted, because some of those arrested had been people she knew personally, including nobles who had attended her birthday celebrations and diplomats who had advised her father before betraying him. Jake reminded her that betrayal hurt worse when it came from people you trusted, but that recognizing the truth was better than living with comfortable lies that could get you killed. She agreed, though it did not make the pain any less sharp when she thought about how many years the conspiracy had operated while her father slowly died from poison administered by people he considered friends. Ember spoke in his rumbling voice, saying that betrayal was common throughout history and that dragons had learned long ago to judge people by their actions rather than their words or their public reputations. The ceremony continued with speeches from various leaders praising the heroes who had fought at Crosspoint and promising that such threats would never again be allowed to grow unchecked. Lyra was asked to speak, and she walked to the podium feeling nervous because she had never been good at public speaking, despite years of royal training. She talked about her father and his vision of a galaxy where different species worked together rather than competing for dominance, and how he had given his life trying to protect that vision from those who feared change. She also talked about Jake and how she had mocked him when they first met, because she had judged him by surface characteristics rather than looking deeper to see his true character. Her voice broke slightly when she admitted that she had been wrong about humans and had learned more in 6 months with Jake than she had learned in decades of royal education that taught elven superiority as if it were proven fact. Jake looked uncomfortable with the attention, but Lyra could feel through their connection that he appreciated her honesty, even if he wished she had not made such a personal speech in front of thousands of people. After the ceremony, they walked through the memorial gardens where trees from dozens of worlds grew together, creating a living symbol of the diversity that made the galaxy strong. Lyra asked Jake if he regretted accepting her father's will and bonding with Ember, which had tied his fate to theirs for the rest of his extended lifespan. He thought about it carefully before answering that he had not expected any of this when he received the summons to the will reading, but that he would not change his choices, even knowing how difficult the path had been. She asked why, and he explained that most people went through life never finding a purpose worth dying for, and he had been given that purpose along with companions who made the struggle meaningful. Lyra realized that she felt the same way, because 6 months ago she had been a princess living in comfortable isolation, surrounded by people who told her what she wanted to hear rather than what she needed to know. Now she was part of something larger than herself, working to build a future where species judged each other by merit rather than biology, and where cooperation replaced competition. Ember interrupted their conversation by reminding them that the joint military exercises were scheduled to begin soon, and that Kate expected them to participate as examples of human-elven cooperation. Jake groaned because military exercises meant endless briefings and coordinating with officers who still did not fully understand how dragon-bonded combat worked. But he went anyway because that was part of his duty, and Lyra followed because she had learned that showing up and doing the work was more important than complaining about how tedious it could be. The exercises brought together forces from multiple species, and Lyra watched as human soldiers trained alongside elven warriors, sharing techniques and learning from each other in ways that would have been unthinkable a year ago. She participated in the magical combat demonstrations and was surprised when human soldiers asked intelligent questions about elven sorcery and suggested ways to combine it with their technology. One young human named Lisa Chen asked if Lyra could teach her basic teleportation theory because she had ideas about using it to improve emergency medical response times in combat situations. Lyra agreed and spent several hours explaining magical principles to someone who had no inherent power but understood the underlying mathematics better than many elves who relied on instinct rather than analysis. This kind of cross-species collaboration was happening throughout the galaxy, as the near disaster at Crosspoint had convinced everyone that isolation and supremacy were paths to destruction rather than strength. Jake watched all of this with satisfaction because he had helped create something that would outlast him, even though his dragon bond meant he would live far longer than normal humans. Ember was content, because the dragon had seen civilizations rise and fall and knew that this moment of unity was precious and worth protecting against those who would tear it apart. That evening, Lyra and Jake sat on the Wanderer's observation deck watching stars drift past as they traveled to their next assignment, which involved tracking down conspiracy remnants, hiding in the outer systems. She said quietly that she could not imagine going back to her old life before meeting him, and that even though he had been forced on her by her father's will, she was grateful for everything that had happened. Jake replied that he felt the same way, and that being her guardian had taught him things about courage and trust that he had not fully understood before. They sat in comfortable silence while Ember slept nearby, and Lyra thought about how much had changed since that first day when she had mocked the human who received her in the king's will. She had been arrogant and blind to her own weaknesses, while assuming that long life and magical power made elves superior to younger species. Now she understood that strength came in many forms, and that humans possessed determination and adaptability that were just as valuable as any magical ability. Jake had nearly died multiple times protecting her, and had bonded with Ember knowing it would tie his fate to theirs forever, and all of this from someone she had dismissed as inferior. The universe had taught her humility through fire and blood, and she was grateful for the lesson even though learning it had been painful. She reached out and took Jake's hand, and he squeezed back gently while they watched the stars, and planned for the battles they knew would come, because the conspiracy was wounded but not destroyed, and there would always be those who feared change and preferred the comfortable lies of supremacy to the difficult truth of equality. But Lyra was ready to fight alongside Jake and Ember for as long as it took to build the galaxy her father had dreamed of, where species worked together and judged each other by character rather than genetics. She had stopped mocking the human who received her in the king's will because he had proven himself in every way that mattered and had become someone she trusted more than anyone she had known before. The alien girl and the human guardian and their dragon companion flew together into an uncertain future, but they flew with hope and determination that came from knowing they had already survived impossible odds. And sometimes that was enough to change the galaxy one battle at a time.